Have you ever thought about, like, the microscopic battles being waged inside our bodies when it comes to, fertility and getting pregnant?
Oh, absolutely. It's a whole world down there. And today we're zooming in on a specific battlefield, the uterine lining, but specifically in women with PCOS.
PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome.
Right. A hormonal disorder that affects something like what, 11 to 13% of women of reproductive age?
A huge number of people. And we often talk about the hormonal imbalances, but
Mhm.
what's going on at the cellular level,
Yeah,
like in the actual tissues?
exactly. And for women with PCOS, getting pregnant, staying pregnant, well, those can be huge hurdles.
Not to mention their risk of endometrial cancer. That's
Yeah.
something we don't talk about enough, but it's a serious concern with PCOS.
Absolutely. So some very exciting, very recent research just came out in Nature Medicine.
Ooh, nature medicine. That's the big leagues. Tell me more.
Yeah, researchers over at Karolinska Institute in Sweden, they did a deep, deep dive into the cells that make up the uterine lining in women with PCOS.
So what they find, like what's the headline news from this research?
The big takeaway, they found some very distinct, very significant differences in the uterine lining of women with PCOS compared to those without.
Okay, so different, but different how? Give me the specifics.
Different in the types of cells that are present and also how active certain genes are within those cells, like how those genes are expressing themselves, gene expression, how genes are turning into actual functioning proteins, that whole process.
Right, right. So our deep dive today is all about understanding those cellular differences and, more importantly, what they could mean for, diagnosing and treating the challenges that come with PCOS. I think a lot of our listeners are going to find this really insightful.
Absolutely. And all of this comes straight from that Nature Medicine article. It's our roadmap for this discussion.
Perfect. Okay, so these Swedish researchers,
Uh-huh.
how did they go about studying the uterine lining at such a tiny level?
They created what they call a cell map.
A cell map. So like a map of every single cell.
Yeah, pretty much. They took tissue samples from the uterine lining and then identified and categorized basically almost every individual cell.
Wow. Okay, who are the participants in this study?
They had 12 women with PCOS
Okay.
and then a control group of 5 women without PCOS who were, healthy.
Okay, so a smaller control group, but I guess still big enough to be meaningful.
Yeah, and they were careful about controlling for other variables too. All the women were of a similar age, similar weight and BMI, and they made sure that all the tissue samples were taken during the same phase of the menstrual cycle.
Right, to make sure that the differences they were seeing were actually due to PCOS and not, something else. So besides the PCOS diagnosis, was there a key difference between the groups?
Well, all the women in the study were overweight, but only the women with PCOS had insulin resistance and elevated male sex hormones.
Ah, right, two of the hallmarks of PCOS, insulin resistance and those higher levels of androgens.
Yep.
Okay, so that's how they set up the groups. Now, you said something earlier about analyzing a lot of cells. How many were they actually looking at?
A lot. Almost 250,000 cell nuclei.
Whoa, 250,000. That's incredible. All right, so what stood out in those 250,000 cells? What were the big differences they found?
Well, one of the major findings was the ratio of different cell types in the uterine lining.
Okay, break that down for me.
So they found more epithelial cells in the lining of women with PCOS.
Epithelial, those are the cells that line surfaces, right? Like the inner lining of the uterus.
Exactly. But fewer stromal cells.
Stromal. Remind me what those do again.
Stromal cells, they're like the support system. They give the tissue structure, provide nourishment, help with cell signaling, all the important behind-the-scenes stuff.
So an imbalance in those cell types,
Mm.
what are the researchers saying about why that matters?
Professor Elizabeth Stenner-Victorin, she led the study, and she says that this suggests there's something off in the growth and balance of these cells in women with PCOS,
Interesting.
and that this could contribute to the difficulties getting pregnant, the higher risk of miscarriage, and even the higher risk of endometrial cancer.
I see. So if that lining, that very first point of contact for an embryo, isn't quite right.
Yeah, it makes sense that it could lead to problems down the line.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Now, beyond just the cell types, you mentioned something about gene expression too. What did they find there?
Right. So they looked at the activity levels of genes in specific types of cells.
Okay.
And what they saw was that many genes were behaving abnormally in women with PCOS.
Okay, abnormally in what way? Like overactive, underactive?
Both. And the thing is, a lot of these genes are involved in crucial functions for a successful pregnancy, like the embryo's ability to attach to the uterine wall, genes that are linked to miscarriage, even genes linked to endometrial cancer.
So not random genes, but genes that are specifically relevant to the problems we're talking about.
Exactly. And one of the first authors of the study, Gustav Eriksson, pointed out that this shows there's a communication breakdown happening between the cells in the endometrium of women with PCOS. Like the way they're supposed to interact with each other and send signals, it's all disrupted.
Wow. So the cells are there, but they're not speaking the same language.
Right, exactly. And that's a problem. The endometrium has to be this perfectly synchronized environment for an embryo to implant and thrive if the signals are messed up.
It's not going to work.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the problem. Now, did they look at any potential solutions?
Yes, they did. In the second part of the study, they had the women with PCOS undergo a 16-week intervention.
Yeah, okay. What kind of intervention?
Some received metformin, the diabetes drug.
Right.
Some received lifestyle advice, focusing on diet and exercise.
Okay.
And some got both.
So pretty standard recommendations for managing PCOS. What happened?
Well, they found that both metformin and the lifestyle changes actually help to normalize a lot of the gene activity patterns in the uterine lining cells.
Wow. So it wasn't just masking the symptoms, it was actually addressing those underlying cellular issues.
That seems to be the case. And interestingly, they noted that metformin seemed to have a more pronounced effect.
Metformin, really? More so than lifestyle changes. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and Professor Stinner Victorin said this suggests that metformin is doing more in women with PCOS than just lowering blood sugar.
Right. It's like going deeper, fixing things at a cellular level.
Mm.
Now, this study focused on women with PCOS who were overweight. Do we think these findings apply to women with PCOS who aren't overweight, but, maybe still have insulin resistance?
That's a great question. And Professor Stinner Victorin believes that yes, metformin could very well have similar benefits for those women, especially if they're struggling with fertility or recurrent miscarriages.
So potentially wider implications. Now, you also mentioned earlier that they found some correlations with clinical features of PCOS. What were those?
Right, so they saw that the patterns of gene activity in those specific uterine cells were correlated with the women's levels of male sex hormones and their level of insulin resistance.
So the worse those features were, the more disrupted the cellular activity.
Yeah, basically. It really shows how connected the hormonal and metabolic aspects of PCOS are to what's happening in the uterus.
This is all so incredibly intricate.
It really is. It highlights the complexity of PCOS and how everything's interconnected.
Now, with all these findings, where do we go from here? What are the implications for future treatments?
Well, Professor Stinner Victorin believes that by identifying these specific cellular and genetic changes, this study gives us really valuable targets for developing more effective treatments for the endometrial problems that come with PCOS.
So instead of just treating the symptoms, we could actually address the root cause.
Exactly. And she's hopeful that this research could lead to new drugs that target those specific pathways we've been talking about.
That would be incredible.
Yeah.
Now, before we wrap up, can you tell us a bit about the researchers and who funded this work?
Sure. So Dr. Kumri Lee was a joint first author, and the senior and corresponding authors were associate professors Kwalin Deng and Sophie Petropoulos.
Okay.
And funding came from a number of sources, including the Swedish Research Council, the Novo Nordisk Foundation, the Diabetes Foundation, and the Nutt and Alice Wallenberg Foundation.
A real team effort. And for those who want to read the study themselves, where can they find it?
It's published in Nature Medicine. The title is Single-Cell Profiling of the Human Endometrium in Polycystic Ovary Syndrome, and you can find it online using the DOI, doi.org, 10.1038 and 41591 025 035 92 City.
Fantastic. Okay, let's sum this all up. What are the big takeaways for our listeners today?
Well, the main point is that women with PCOS, their uterine lining, it's different. Different cell types, different gene activity. And these differences could explain why so many women with PCOS have trouble getting pregnant, staying pregnant, and why their risk of endometrial cancer is higher.
Right. But this research also offers hope, right?
Yeah.
Because it shows that treatments like metformin and lifestyle changes can actually reverse some of these abnormalities.
Absolutely. And it paves the way for even more targeted therapies in the future.
So here's a final thought for everyone. If we can map out the cellular communication in the uterine lining and see how it goes wrong in PCOS, imagine what other conditions we could understand better by looking at this kind of cellular crosstalk. It makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does. It opens up a whole new world of possibilities for understanding and treating all sorts of diseases.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.